Three pilots, three separate conversations, three separate moments where a man with experience, with certification, with the specific knowledge that comes from years of flying, looked at John F. Kennedy Jr. and said the same thing. Don't fly tonight. The conditions are wrong. The visibility is dropping. The route over water at night without instrument certification, it is not safe. Don't fly tonight. Three pilots said this. John F. Kennedy Jr. thanked each one. He was polite. He was charming. He was, by every account from the people who knew him, genuinely kind, in the way that people who have never had to face the consequences of their own decisions are often genuinely kind. And then he flew anyway. On the 16th of July, 1999, at approximately 9:40 inches the evening, John F. Kennedy Jr. lost spatial orientation over the dark water off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. His Piper Saratoga entered what aviation investigators call a graveyard spiral. The aircraft impacted the water at approximately 270 miles per hour. There were no survivors. His wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, was 33 years old. Her sister, Lauren Bessette, was 34 years old. John F. Kennedy Jr. was 38 years old. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation that followed produced a report. That report used specific language, careful language, the kind of language that government investigators use when they are trying to be precise rather than emotional. The probable cause of the crash was, and I am reading directly from the NTSB report, the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was a result of spatial disorientation. The pilot's failure, not the weather, not the plane, not fate. Not the Kennedy curse, which is what the newspapers reached for immediately, because the Kennedy curse is a story the world knows how to tell, and accountability is a story the world has always found considerably more difficult. The pilot's failure. I am Mary, and today, for the first time in any coverage of this story that I have found, we are going to talk about John F. Kennedy Jr., not as a victim of circumstance, not as America's golden prince cut down by tragedy, not as the 3-year-old boy who saluted his father's casket and grew up in the specific, consuming weight of that image. We are going to talk about him as the person who made the decision that killed Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and Lauren Bessette. Not because he was evil, not because he was cruel, not because he didn't love the people on that plane, but because 3 pilots warned him, and he flew anyway. And if we keep calling that a tragedy, if we keep reaching for the Kennedy curse rather than the NTSB report, then we are doing to John F. Kennedy Jr. exactly what his name did for him his entire life. We are protecting him from accountability. Stay with me. Before the 16th of July, 1999, before Carolyn, before Lauren, before the 3 pilots, there was another woman, another near miss, another moment where John F. Kennedy Jr.'s specific recklessness nearly cost someone their life, and the world never connected it to what happened over the water that July night. That detail is coming, and when it arrives, it will change everything about how you understand the 16th of July, 1999. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. was born on the 25th of November, 1960, 2 weeks after his father was elected President of the United States. He was born into the most photographed family in American history, at the specific moment that family's power was at its absolute peak. He was 3 years old when his father was assassinated. The state funeral was held on his 3rd birthday, and in a moment that NBC News Vice President Julian Goodman called the most impressive shot in the history of television, 3-year-old John Kennedy stepped forward from his mother's side and saluted his father's flag-draped casket as it was carried from the cathedral. That image is still one of the most reproduced photographs in American history. The little boy who saluted. Now here is what that image did to John Kennedy's life, and I want you to hold this, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. That image required something from him. From the moment it was taken, the world had decided, in the specific, consuming way that America decides things about its public figures, who John Kennedy Jr. was supposed to be. He was supposed to be the heir, the prince, the continuation of something the country had lost and needed to believe could be recovered. He was 3 years old. He grew up inside that image, inside the specific, suffocating pressure of being the son of a martyred president in a country that had decided his father's death meant something larger than a single assassination. The weight of Camelot, the weight of the salute, the weight of a name that had been printed in more headlines than almost any other name in American history. And here is what that weight produced, not in the ways the mythology describes, but in the ways that the documented record shows. It produced a man who was protected from failure. Every time he failed, the world reframed it. He failed his New York bar exam twice. He was unable to pass the examination that grants the legal right to practice law in the state of New York. The first failure was reported by the New York Daily News with the headline, "The Hunk Flunks." Not a lawyer who needs to study harder. The hunk flunks. His failure was converted, immediately and effortlessly, into a charming human moment, into evidence of his approachability, into proof that even America's golden prince had to work for things. He failed it a second time. The coverage was similarly gentle. He vowed he would keep taking it until he was 95 or he passed. The world found this admirable rather than alarming. He passed on his third attempt. His mother, Jacqueline Kennedy, who understood more about the management of public image than perhaps anyone of her generation, tried to protect him from a different kind of failure. She did not want him to fly. She had said explicitly to her longtime companion, Maurice Templesman, who tried to act on her concern after her death, that she wanted him to stay out of planes, that she worried about his recklessness. That she knew, in the specific way of a woman who had watched her husband's brains blown out in a moving car, what happened when the men in her life made decisions that exceeded their capabilities. Jackie Kennedy died in May 1994. John Kennedy began taking flying lessons the following year. He received his pilot's license in April 1998. He had approximately 300 hours of flight time by the summer of 1999. He did not have his instrument rating. Now, here is what an instrument rating is, and why it matters specifically to what happened on the 16th of July 1999. The horizon, the ground, landmarks. When visibility is clear and the pilot can see where they are and where they are going, VFR certification is sufficient. Instrument flight rules. The certification John Kennedy did not hold allow a pilot to fly using cockpit instruments when external visual references are unavailable. In fog, in darkness, over featureless terrain. In the specific conditions that the 16th of July 1999 produced over the water between New Jersey and Martha's Vineyard, hazy evening air, no visible horizon, the Atlantic Ocean indistinguishable from the sky. IFR certification is not a bureaucratic technicality. It is the difference between a pilot who can maintain spatial orientation when their eyes cannot tell them which way is up, and a pilot who cannot. John Kennedy could not. He knew this. The 3 pilots who warned him knew this. The NTSB investigators who spent months examining the crash site knew this. And here is the question I want you to carry into the next section, because the answer is coming, and it is the most specific thing this video will ask you to sit with. In the 14 months between April 1998, when he received his pilot's license, and July 1999, why had John F. Kennedy Jr. not obtained his instrument rating? The answer is not that he couldn't. He had the money. He had the time. He had, by the accounts of flight instructors who worked with him, sufficient aptitude. The answer is something else. And it tells you something specific about the man behind the image. John Kennedy's flight instructor, the person who knew his flying ability most precisely, made a specific assessment of what John could and could not do in the cockpit. That assessment was documented. And it directly addresses the question of whether what happened on the 16th of July 1999 was unexpected. That detail is coming. Before Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, before Lauren, before the 3 pilots on the 16th of July 1999, there was Christina Haag. Christina Haag dated John F. Kennedy Jr. from 1985 to 1990. 5 years. They had known each other as children. They had both attended Brown University. By every account from people who knew them during this period, they genuinely loved each other. And here is the detail about Christina Haag that almost no coverage of the July 16 crash has ever connected to what happened that night. She was nearly killed while with John Kennedy. More than once. John Kennedy was a man who sought risk the way that some people seek comfort. This is documented not as a character assassination, but as a clinical observation made by people who studied him carefully. He kayaked in conditions that required rescue. He rock climbed. He rollerbladed through Manhattan traffic in ways that alarmed the people around him. He flew. The cousin, Michael Kennedy, who died in a skiing accident in December 1998, had prompted John to take a temporary break from flying. But when John resumed his lessons after Michael's death, his sister Caroline hoped he might stop permanently. She did little, ultimately, to make that happen. Anthony Radziwill was John's best man, his cousin, his closest male friend. Anthony was dying of cancer in 1999, a battle that had consumed the final years of his life, and that John had been present for, with genuine, documented love. Anthony was the person who had sat in hospital with Christina during her recovery from an incident involving John's carelessness. The specific incident is documented in the accounts of people who knew them. I want to be careful here because the precise details vary across sources. What is consistent across multiple accounts is this: Christina Haag was endangered during her time with John Kennedy in ways that were directly connected to his risk-taking behavior. That this was not a single incident, but a pattern. That Anthony Radziwill, the decent, steady, loyal man who outlived John by exactly 1 month, was the person who showed up to sit with Christina when John did not. Now Naomi Haag, who was not there. Now Daryl Hannah. After his relationship with Christina ended, John Kennedy dated Daryl Hannah for 5.5 years. They had known each other since their families vacationed together in the early 1980s. They reunited at the wedding of his aunt, Lee Radziwill, in 1988. The relationship with Daryl Hannah has been characterized in almost every account, including the Ryan Murphy FX series that aired in February 2026, as a complication that John needed to move past before he could commit. To Carolyn. Daryl herself has disputed the portrayal of her in that series. She disputed it specifically and on the record. The show portrayed her as a woman who didn't understand the relationship. Daryl said this was not accurate. What multiple accounts do confirm is this: John Kennedy ended the relationship with Daryl Hannah in ways that were, by most documented assessments, considerably less than considerate. He was not consistently kind to women who loved him. He was charming and warm and present in the specific moments when charm and warmth and presence came easily, and he was absent, sometimes painfully, when they did not. This is a pattern, and patterns matter, because on the 16th of July, 1999, the pattern was the same one that had been present throughout his adult life. The conditions required something from him that he had not fully prepared for, and he proceeded anyway. His flight instructor, whose name and assessments appear in the aviation investigation documents, had noted that John was a cautious pilot when flying with his instructor present, that he was capable of the basic requirements of VFR flight, that he was not yet at the level where solo night flights over water in marginal conditions were advisable. This assessment was made by the person most qualified to make it. John Kennedy had approximately 300 hours of total flight time. His instructor had recommended he not fly at night without a safety pilot, a more experienced pilot in the cockpit alongside him, until he had more experience with the specific conditions that night flying produced. He did not have a safety pilot on the 16th of July, 1999. He had his wife and his sister-in-law. On the morning of the 16th of July, 1999, John Kennedy made a series of decisions about the departure time, about the safety pilot he chose not to take, about the weather briefing he received, and what he did with the information in it. Each decision built on the last, and together they produced something that the NTSB did not call a tragedy. I am going to walk you through each decision, and I want you to ask yourself, at which point could this have been stopped? The 16th of July, 1999. a Friday evening in summer. John Kennedy and his wife Carolyn were traveling from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard, a route of approximately 180 miles over water. Lauren Bessette was flying with them as far as Martha's Vineyard, where she would catch a connection to Nantucket for a weekend with friends. John and Carolyn would continue to Hyannisport for the wedding of his cousin Rory Kennedy the following day. The original plan had been to leave in daylight, in the afternoon, when the conditions over the water would have been clear enough for VFR flight, the only kind John Kennedy was certified to fly. This is the first decision. Carolyn was late, significantly late. The accounts vary, some say 2 hours, some say approximately 90 minutes. But the documented departure time tells the story precisely. John Kennedy departed Essex County Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, at 8:38 inches the evening. At 8:38, on the 16th of July, 1999, the sun had been below the horizon for approximately 40 minutes. The flight to Martha's Vineyard took approximately 1 hour, which means that every minute of the actual flight from departure to the point of impact took place in darkness. The original plan would have had them flying in full daylight. One decision, the decision to wait rather than fly or reschedule, moved the departure from afternoon into darkness. Now the weather. The National Weather Service had issued advisories for the area that evening. The conditions were hazy, the visibility was reduced. The horizon line over the Atlantic Ocean, which a VFR pilot requires to maintain spatial orientation, was difficult to distinguish. The aviation term for what John Kennedy encountered is called the dark hole phenomenon. On a clear night over water, a pilot can use stars and city lights to maintain a sense of which way is up. On a hazy night, over featureless ocean, no lights below, no horizon visible, no stars above the cockpit instruments, are the only reliable source of orientation information. John Kennedy did not have the certification to trust his cockpit instruments over his physical sense of orientation. He had 300 hours of flight time. His flight instructor had recommended a safety pilot for exactly these conditions. He did not take a safety pilot. Now, the 3 pilots. Before departing, John Kennedy spoke with pilots who expressed concern about the flight. The specific conversations are documented in the accounts of the investigation. 3 separate individuals with varying levels of formality in their relationship to Kennedy and to the flight told him the conditions were not advisable for a pilot of his experience flying the route without instrument. Certification. He thanked them. He flew anyway. At 9:38, approximately 1 hour after departure, the plane began its descent toward Martha's Vineyard Airport. The approach to Martha's Vineyard requires a descent over open ocean. No landmarks, no lights below. On a hazy July night, no visible horizon. John Kennedy had been flying for approximately 1 hour when the disorientation began. The NTSB investigation reconstructed what happened from radar data and the wreckage pattern. In the final minutes of the flight, Kennedy initiated a right turn and began a descent. The descent became increasingly steep. The aircraft entered what investigators call a graveyard spiral, a condition where the pilot, lacking reliable external visual cues, cannot feel the spiral they are in because the vestibular system adjusts to the rotation. In a graveyard spiral, the pilot's body tells them they are flying level. The instruments tell them they are not. John Kennedy did not have the training to trust his instruments over his body. At 9:40 p.m., the aircraft impacted the water at approximately 270 miles per hour. The ocean depth at the impact site was approximately 116 feet. The bodies were found on July 21, 5 days after the crash. All 3 were still strapped to their seats. Lauren Bessette was 34 years old. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was 33 years old. John F. Kennedy Jr. was 38 years old. Now here is what I want to ask you directly. At which point in this sequence the delayed departure, the hazy conditions, the absence of a safety pilot, the 3 pilots who warned him, the instrument rating he had not obtained in 14 months of flying, at which point could this have been stopped? The answer is, at any of them. Any single different decision on the 16th of July, 1999, or in the 14 months of flying before it, and the outcome is different. This is not fate. This is a sequence of decisions. And the most important question this video can ask, the question that the Kennedy mythology has always made difficult to ask, is why none of those different decisions were made. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was 2 hours late to the airport on the 16th of July, 1999. She had expressed fear about flying with John on multiple documented occasions. What her lateness that evening actually meant, and what it cost her, is the most specific thing I want you to think about before this video ends. That is coming. There is a specific question that the coverage of JFK Jr.'s death has never asked directly. Why did John Kennedy not have his instrument rating? He received his pilot's license in April 1998. He died in July 1999. 14 months. He had the money to pay for the training. He had the time. His schedule, while busy, was not the schedule of someone who could not carve out the hours required. He had, by the assessments of flight instructors who worked with him, sufficient aptitude to achieve the certification. He simply had not done it. And here is the answer that the documented record points toward, not as speculation, but as the logical conclusion of a pattern that had been present throughout his adult life. John F. Kennedy Jr. had never been required to fully prepare before proceeding. The bar exam, he failed it twice, and the world called him charming. He proceeded to practice law at the Manhattan DA's office on a conditional basis that would have been unavailable to any candidate without his name. The magazine George, launched in 1995, with the specific advantage of his political celebrity and his famous face. When the magazine began failing, when the power struggle with his co-founder Michael Berman produced screaming matches and a physical altercation, when the sales dropped and Hachette Filipaki expressed concern, investors and partners continued to support it at levels of patience that were, by any business analysis, directly connected to whose name was on the masthead. The flying, he had 300 hours. He had a VFR license. He had his instructor's assessment that he was not yet ready for solo night flights over water in marginal conditions. He had not obtained the instrument rating his instructor effectively required. And he flew anyway. Because here is what the name did throughout his life. It removed consequences. When John Kennedy failed something, the failure was reframed as a charming human moment. When he took risks, the risks were characterized as evidence of his adventurous spirit. When he hurt people, and he did hurt people, documented in the accounts of women who loved him, the hurt was minimized or ignored or absorbed into the larger narrative of the Golden Prince, who was simply larger than ordinary accountability. The name did not do this maliciously. Institutions do not act with malice. They act with logic. And the logic of the Kennedy name, the logic that had been operating since the 22nd of November 1963, was that this man was too important to be held to the same standard as other men. Too important to be told no. Too important to be held to the standard his flight instructor recommended. Too important for 3 pilots' warnings to constitute an actual barrier. Now Carolyn Bessette Kennedy knew that John's flying made her nervous. This is documented in multiple accounts from people who were close to the marriage. She had expressed it. She had said, in various ways, and to various people, that she was not comfortable with the plan to fly. She was 2 hours late to the airport on the 16th of July, 1999. I want to be careful here because I am not assigning blame to Carolyn for her own death. The NTSB report is explicit: the pilot's failure, not the passenger's lateness, not any decision made by anyone other than the man at the controls. But I want to talk about what her lateness meant. 2 hours late is not a traffic delay. Manhattan to a New Jersey airport on a Friday evening in summer is not a 2-hour journey from any starting point in the borough. 2 hours late is something else. 2 hours late is a body that knows something the mind has not fully articulated, a physical resistance that expresses itself as delay rather than refusal, because refusal would have required her to say directly what her body was already saying indirectly. She was afraid. She had been afraid before. Multiple documented conversations about her discomfort with his flying, and she had, because this is what the Kennedy Institution required of its women gotten on the planes anyway. And the world, in its coverage of the crash, sometimes blamed her lateness for the darkness. If she had been on time, the logic goes, they would have left in daylight. The conditions would have been different. And that logic places the responsibility for what happened on the woman who was afraid, rather than on the man who had not obtained his instrument rating in 14 months of flying. That inversion of accountability is the Kennedy mythology operating at its most specific. Carolyn was late because she was afraid. She was afraid because John's flying documented, assessed by his own instructor, warned against by 3 pilots, was genuinely frightening to the people who loved him. Her lateness did not cause the crash. His decisions did. Lauren Bessette was going to Nantucket. Her own weekend, her own plans. She offered to come on that flight because her sister was nervous. She organized her own death out of love. And the world for 25 years has sometimes allowed the narrative of Carolyn's lateness to become part of the story of why 3 people died. Before this video ends, I want to correct that narrative directly. Here is what the NTSB investigation found. The probable cause of the accident was the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was a result of spatial disorientation. The pilot's failure. Contributing factors identified in the report included the haze and the dark conditions over the water, the absence of a visible horizon, the specific challenge of maintaining spatial orientation in the conditions present that evening. These are contributing factors. They are not the cause. The cause was the pilot's failure. And here is the specific finding about John Kennedy's instrument certification, or rather the absence of it, that the NTSB included in their analysis. His total flight experience was insufficient for the conditions. His instructor had noted that John required a safety pilot for night flights. He did not have a safety pilot. His instrument training was incomplete. The conditions on the evening of July 16 required instrument proficiency. He did not have instrument proficiency. Now I want to say something about Anthony Radziwill. Anthony Radziwill was dying when John Kennedy died. His cancer had been consuming him for years. He was John's best man, his closest friend, the person who had been present for John in ways that nobody else had been, who had sat with Christina Haag during her recovery, who had been the specific, steady presence that John's life required and that John himself sometimes failed to be for others. Anthony outlived John by 39 days. He died on the 10th of August, 1999. He was 40 years old. The specific irony that this video began by noting, and that the comments on the footage of the crash coverage have noted, is that in the months before July 16, John Kennedy had been working on Anthony's eulogy, preparing for the death that everyone could see coming. The cancer that was taking his best friend slowly and documented. Anthony outlived John. The eulogy John had been preparing, Anthony never delivered it. Instead, Anthony Radziwill died 39 days after his best friend, in the specific, terrible aftermath of a crash that Anthony had to process while he himself was dying, carrying the loss of John and Carolyn and Lauren into his own final weeks. The NTSB does not have a category for what Anthony Radziwill experienced in those 39 days. But I want to name it here because this video is about what John Kennedy's decisions cost the people who loved him. They cost Carolyn Bessette Kennedy her life at 33. They cost Lauren Bessette her life at 34, a woman who had come on that flight because her sister was afraid, who had organized her own death out of love. They cost Anne Freeman both of her daughters on the same July evening. They cost Anthony Radziwill, who had 39 days, left the ability to die without first losing his best friend. They cost Caroline Kennedy her last immediate family member. Her parents were gone. Her brother was gone. She was 39 years old, and she was alone. These are the costs, and they deserve to be said directly, not as cruelty toward a man who is gone and cannot respond, but as accuracy. Because accuracy is the thing that 25 years of Kennedy mythology has made persistently difficult. John Kennedy was not a villain. He was a genuinely kind man, by most accounts. A good friend, by the testimony of people who knew him. A man who had grown up in circumstances of extraordinary difficulty, the assassination, the public grief, the weight of a name that the country needed to mean something, and who had done his best to build a life that was authentically his own. He was also a man who had never been required to prepare fully before proceeding, a man whose failures had always been reframed as charm, a man whose risk-taking had always been characterized as spirit rather than recklessness, a man whose specific, documented flying deficiencies, 300 hours, no instrument rating, an instructor who recommended a safety pilot had not been treated as barriers by anyone in his life, including himself. And on the 16th of July, 1999, the barrier finally appeared. It was not a barrier of institutions or of public image or of the Kennedy name. It was the dark Atlantic Ocean, and it did not reframe anything. There is one more thing I want to say before this video ends, about the word tragedy, about why I have not used it once in this entire video, and what that choice means for how we remember Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and Lauren Bessette. The word tragedy has appeared in approximately every piece of coverage of the 16th of July, 1999 crash since the night it happened. A tragedy, a tragic accident. The Kennedy family's latest tragedy. I have not used that word once in this video, not because I am without empathy for what happened, not because I believe John Kennedy was a bad person, not because I think the grief of the people who loved him, Caroline Kennedy, Anthony Radziwill in his final 39 days, the friends and colleagues who have spoken about him with genuine warmth and genuine loss, was not real. I have not used that word because tragedy implies inevitability. A tragedy is something that happens to people, something that descends, something that the fates or the Kennedy curse, if you prefer that framing, produce without regard for what the people inside it chose to do. What happened on the 16th of July, 1999, was not that. It was a sequence of decisions, each one chosen, each one preceded by information that pointed toward a different choice. Each one made by a man who had grown up in a world that had taught him consistently and thoroughly that his decisions did not require the same preparation that other people's decisions required. 300 hours, no instrument rating, night flight over water, hazy conditions, no safety pilot, 3 warnings from 3 pilots. These are not the ingredients of a tragedy. They are the ingredients of a preventable outcome. And here is why the word matters specifically, not abstractly, in the story of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and Lauren Bessette. If it is a tragedy, then it happened to Carolyn and Lauren. They were victims of fate, of the Kennedy curse, of the random, uncontrollable convergence of hazy conditions and a dark evening and a family that has always suffered loss. If it is a preventable outcome, then Carolyn and Lauren were killed by specific decisions made by the pilot of the aircraft they were passengers in. The first framing erases accountability. The second framing restores it. And here is what restoring accountability actually does for Carolyn and for Lauren, not as an act of anger toward John Kennedy, but as an act of accuracy toward the women who died on that plane. It says that Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was not a casualty of the Kennedy curse. She was a woman who had expressed documented fear about her husband's flying, who had been late to the airport on the evening of July 16 inches, the physical way that fear sometimes expresses itself, and who died because the pilot of the plane she was on did not have the instrument certification his own instructor had identified as necessary for the conditions of that flight. It says that Lauren Bessette was not the third name in a tragedy headline. She was a woman who had been going to Nantucket her own weekend, her own life, who had offered to come on the flight because her sister was nervous, and who died because she was loyal. And because the person responsible for getting her safely to Martha's Vineyard had made decisions for 14 months that had left him unequipped for the darkness over that water. Accuracy is not cruelty. Accuracy is what Carolyn and Lauren deserved from the world when they were alive and did not always receive. Accuracy is what they deserve now. John F. Kennedy Jr. was 38 years old when he died. He had been named the sexiest man alive by People magazine in 1988. He had worked for 4 years as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, where his boss said he worked in the same crummy cubbyhole as everybody else and was always pleased with his work. He had founded George magazine, an attempt to make politics accessible and entertaining that struggled financially, but that he loved with a genuine, documented passion. He had married Carolyn Bessette in a private ceremony on Cumberland Island, Georgia, in September 1996, a ceremony so carefully hidden from the press that the guests themselves did not know the location until they were on their way. He was, by the testimony of people who actually knew him, a good man, a warm man, a man who was kind to strangers and loyal to his friends, and who carried the weight of the most famous name in American political history with more grace than most people could have managed. He was also a man whose specific, documented deficiencies as a pilot, deficiencies that his own instructor had identified and that 3 pilots had warned him about, on the evening of July 16 killed 2 women who trusted him with their lives. Both of these things are true. And here is what I take from that specific, uncomfortable truth. The world does people a disservice when it protects them from accountability. Not because accountability is punishment, but because accountability is preparation. Because the specific, uncomfortable process of being told that you are not ready, that the conditions exceed your current capability, that you need more preparation before you proceed, is the process that builds competence. John Kennedy had been protected from that process his entire life. The bar exam failures became charm. The magazine's struggles became the poignant story of a prince trying to find his own path. The flying deficiencies noted by his instructor, known by 3 pilots, sensed by his wife, in the specific way that fear expresses itself as a 2-hour delay, were absorbed into the larger narrative of a man who took risks and was admired for it, until the one risk he took that the world could not reframe. Here is what I want to say to the people watching this video who are angry at what I have said today, who feel that I have been unfair to a man who cannot respond, who believe that I have taken something that should be remembered as a tragedy and made it into an indictment. I have not said that John Kennedy was a bad person. I have said that he made specific decisions that killed Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and Lauren Bessette. I have said that those decisions were preceded by warnings he chose not to act on. I have said that a system, the Kennedy name, the Kennedy mythology, the specific cultural machinery that had been protecting this man from the full weight of his own choices since the moment the photograph of the salute was taken, contributed to an environment where those warnings were not treated as barriers. I have said all of this because Carolyn and Lauren deserve it. Because the woman who was 2 hours late because she was afraid deserves to have her fear acknowledged rather than converted into a contributing factor. Because the woman who offered to come because her sister was nervous deserves to have her death understood as a consequence of specific decisions, not as the 3rd casualty of the Kennedy curse. Because accuracy, even when it is uncomfortable, is the only form of respect that endures. 3 pilots warned him. He flew anyway. That is not a tragedy. That is a decision. And the people who paid for that decision, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, Lauren Bessette, Anthony Radziwill in his final 39 days, Anne Freeman in the specific, private grief of losing both daughters on the same July evening, Caroline Kennedy, at 39 years old, with nobody left. They deserved better than a name that protected the man who made it. Before you go, I want to ask you one question. If John Kennedy had been required at any point in his life to face the full weight of a failure, if the bar exam had been reported as a failure rather than a charming stumble, if the magazine's struggles had been examined honestly, if his flight instructor's recommendation about a safety pilot had been treated as a requirement rather than a suggestion, would any of the decisions of the 16th of July, 1999 have been different? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this video moved you, please share it. Because Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and Lauren Bessette have been carried in the slipstream of a name for 25 years. And they deserve to be carried in their own right. They were first. They were always first. Next, we go somewhere different. A woman whose story connects to this one in ways that will become clear the moment I begin telling it. A woman who also loved a Kennedy man, who also paid costs that the Kennedy mythology preferred not to acknowledge, and whose specific survival, the specific, hard-won survival of a woman who outlived the institution that tried to consume her, is one of the most remarkable things this series has covered. Subscribe so you do not miss it. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.